Welcome to Chatterbox, kids. Today's story is very interesting and emotional. It will touch your heart and inspire your mind. Let's begin this beautiful journey together. Chapter 1. I never knew my father's name. I was 6 years old when I learned that silence can be louder than words. My mother never told me who my father was. She just said, "Some questions hurt more than answers." We lived in a one-room house made of broken bricks and secrets. The roof leaked when it rained and the floor was always cold. But what hurt more was the coldness in people's eyes when they saw me. They would whisper, "She's the daughter of no one." I didn't understand it back then. All I knew was that my lunch was always half of what others had. My books were torn. My slippers never matched. But my dreams, they were loud. Louder than hunger. Louder than shame. I wanted to become a teacher. Not because I loved books. I hated them. They reminded me of everything I didn't have. But I wanted to be the person I never saw. Someone who believed in kids like me. Someone who didn't ask about fathers. My mother worked 2 jobs. She washed dishes in rich people's homes during the day and sewed clothes at night. Her hands were always cracked, but she smiled when I showed her a paper with a gold star. "You'll go far," she used to whisper, while blowing on her fingers, too tired to touch me. But then, one winter, she didn't come home. They found her on the roadside the next morning, dead from cold, or maybe from life. And that's where my real story begins. Chapter 2. I slept in the railway station. That night after my mother died, no one came for me. Not the neighbors, not the people she worked for. They all turned their eyes away, pretending they didn't know a little girl had just lost everything. I packed my mother's old scarf, a notebook, and 2 pieces of bread. I didn't cry. I didn't know how. I walked to the railway station and sat near the wall, where the smell of tea mixed with smoke and sadness. That became my first night alone. A kind tea seller, Uncle Sadiq, gave me a blanket. He didn't ask questions, just looked at me and said, "Some children carry too much pain, but pain can become power." I didn't understand then. I just held the blanket tight. For the next few weeks, I lived there. I cleaned cups for Uncle Sadiq, and in return, he gave me food and let me sleep on a bench after midnight. Every morning, I woke up before the police could see me. One day, a woman dropped her purse. I picked it up and ran after her. She looked surprised. "You didn't take anything?" she asked. I said, "My mother said, even when you're hungry, don't lose your truth." She smiled. Her name was Madame Fareritas, and she ran a school for poor children. "Come with me," she said. That day, I left the railway station. That day, I took my first step toward becoming someone. Chapter 3. The girl with a stomach, full of hunger and a head full of dreams. At Madame Fareritas' school, I sat on the floor with other children like me. Some were orphans, some had parents but no money. Some had both but still felt empty. But I had something else. Fire. I studied every night under a broken streetlight. I cleaned Madame Fareritas' classroom after others left. I asked questions until my voice hurt She gave me old textbooks, and I read them until the letters danced in my eyes. Years passed. By the time I was 14, I knew I wanted to become a doctor. Not for money, not for pride, but because I never wanted another mother to die on the roadside like mine. I wanted to save lives, but dreams are expensive, and I was still poor. So I worked every day before school, washing dishes, ironing clothes, running errands, and every night I studied like my life depended on it, because it did. People laughed. A tea seller's girl wants to become a doctor? But I remembered my mother's cracked hands. I remembered sleeping hungry. I remembered silence. And I kept going. Chapter 4. The entrance exam was my battlefield. When I turned 17, I applied for the medical entrance exam. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. The registration form alone cost more than what I earned in 2 weeks. I skipped meals, worked extra hours, and walked miles just to save money. On the day of submission, I was still short. I stood outside the office, clutching the half-filled form, eyes full of fear. That's when Madame Fareritas came. She didn't say a word. She just looked into my eyes, pulled out her purse, and paid the fee. She whispered, "You will return this one day, not to me, but to someone else who needs it." I nodded. That day I promised myself, I will become a doctor, or I will die trying. The exam was in a big city. It was the first time I had left my town. I sat in a crowded bus for 10 hours, holding my books and my breath. I didn't know what hotels felt like. I slept outside the exam center with a bag under my head. Inside the exam hall, I was surrounded by students in clean uniforms, expensive watches, and branded pens. I had one pen, and the ink was already fading. But I had something they didn't: hunger, fire, and pain. I wrote like I was writing my future. And when it was over, I closed my eyes and said, "Mama, I did what you couldn't." I reached the door. Chapter 5. The letter that changed everything weeks past. I returned to my tea stall job, trying not to think too much. People laughed again. Dreams are for the rich, they said. But one morning, Uncle Sadiq handed me a torn envelope. It had my name on it. My hands shook as I opened it. I had to read it 3 times before I understood. I got selected. I screamed. I laughed. I cried for the first time since my mother died. But joy didn't last long. I needed money for fees, books, and hostel stay. More than I had ever seen in my life. I was ready to give up. That evening, I sat near the old railway wall and whispered, "Why did you bring me this far just to push me back?" A few minutes later, Madame Fareritas came and sat beside me. "You think you're alone?" she said. "You're not." She had spoken to a few kind people, an old teacher, a retired doctor, and a widow who believed in second chances. Together, they arranged enough for my first year. I cried again, this time from hope. I packed my little bag, hugged Uncle Sadiq, and left. This time, I wasn't running from life. I was running toward it. Chapter 6. I was the only one without a phone. The day I stepped into medical college, I felt like a ghost in a palace. Girls wore expensive clothes, walked with confidence, and smelled like flowers. Boys laughed in groups, talking about trips and gadgets. Everyone seemed to belong, except me. I wore the same dress I had worn for 3 years, washed so many times it had faded. My shoes had a hole in the back. My hands were rough from years of work, and I was the only student without a phone. I didn't know how to open a laptop. I didn't even know how to pronounce half the words in our textbooks. They noticed. They whispered. They laughed. One boy once said, "Did she walk here from a village?" I wanted to disappear, but every night I looked at the photo of my mother that I kept hidden in my book, and I reminded myself, "You didn't come here to fit in. You came here to fight." So I studied harder. I stayed in the library after everyone left. I asked questions when others were too proud to. I watched free videos on borrowed phones. I made notes on the back of torn papers. And slowly, something started to change. A professor called me into her office one day. She looked at me kindly and said, "Where do you come from, child?" I told her. She didn't say much. She just nodded and said, "Keep going. You have something rare. You want this." Chapter 7. My hands shook the first time I touched a patient. In my second year, I entered the hospital ward as a trainee. The smell of medicine, blood, and human pain filled the air. I saw people crying, screaming, praying. It wasn't like books. It was raw. It was real. A nurse handed me a file. "Room 208. Take vitals." My legs froze. It was a man in his 50s, coughing blood, his wife holding his hand tightly. I greeted them and reached for the stethoscope, but my hands shook. I had never touched a patient before, never held someone's pain like this. The man looked at me and smiled weakly. "First time?" he asked. I nodded. He said, "Don't worry. Just do it with heart." That day, I didn't just check a patient. I stepped into the world of healing. Afterward, I cried in the washroom, not because I was scared, but because for the first time, I felt like I belonged. I wasn't just the poor girl anymore. I was becoming a doctor. Chapter 8. I failed one exam and it broke me. I was in my third year, standing at the edge of everything I had ever worked for. One exam, pathology, had always been my weakness. The words were long, the concepts complex, and my brain was tired. I was working nights in a small clinic to pay for food. I hardly slept. I ate whatever was cheapest. My body was in class, but my soul was tired. When the results came out, I stood in front of the notice board looking for my roll number. It wasn't there. I searched again, and again, but it wasn't a mistake. I had failed. My legs gave up. I sat down right there on the floor. Students passed by, pretending not to see me. All I could hear was one sentence in my head: "You are not good enough." That night, I didn't go back to the hostel. I walked for hours. I sat on the hospital stairs, holding my head. All these years, all the hunger, all the pain. Was this the end? But then, something happened. A woman came out of the emergency ward, crying and looking around. She needed help to carry her injured child. People were too busy. I stood up, rushed to her, and helped carry the child to the ambulance. The mother held my hand and whispered, God bless you, doctor. She didn't know I had failed, but she called me doctor. That moment lit a fire again. Maybe a paper said I failed, but life still needed me. Chapter 9. I studied with a candle and a prayer. I couldn't afford tuition classes or coaching, so I made a new plan. I sold the last gold earring my mother had left me, the one I had kept all these years in her memory. It broke my heart, but I needed books more than memories. I moved to a cheaper room near the clinic where I worked. It had no fan, no proper light. At night, I studied by candlelight. Sometimes the hunger made my vision blur. Sometimes the loneliness made me question everything. But I kept going. I stopped comparing myself to others. I stopped listening to voices that told me I couldn't do it. And slowly, one chapter at a time, one page at a time, I prepared to take the exam again. This time I didn't study to pass. I studied to prove that a broken girl from nowhere could still become someone. And when the exam day came, I wore the same old dress. I walked into the hall like I had nothing, but believed like I had everything. Chapter 10. I passed, but I didn't celebrate. When the results came out this time, I didn't run to the notice board. I walked quietly, slowly, as if my feet knew the weight of every step. I scanned the list, and there it was, my name, my roll number, my marks. I passed. I stood still, no screaming, no jumping, just silence. Tears filled my eyes, but I wiped them away. I wanted to go outside, look up at the sky and whisper, "Mama, I did it. I'm still here." But I didn't have time to celebrate. There was a sick child waiting in the emergency room. I wore my white coat, not new, but clean, and walked into the ward like I had done it 100 times before. But this time, something was different. This time, I was no longer a student. I was Dr. Amina. Chapter 11. The girl who had nothing now held lives in her hands. The hospital was always full. People cried, begged, prayed. There were days when we didn't eat, nights when we didn't sleep. I worked 14, sometimes 18 hours a day. I stitched wounds, held hands, gave injections, and broke news no one wanted to hear. But I also gave hope. Once, a father came running with his daughter in his arms. She was bleeding after an accident. Other doctors hesitated. I didn't. I cleaned her wounds, stitched her leg, and stayed with her the whole night. The next morning, the father folded his hands and said, "I had no money, but you saved my child." That moment, I remembered all the days I had no money, no food, and no name. Now I had a name. Now I had purpose. Chapter 12. I paid it forward. Years passed. I never forgot my promise to Madame Fareritas, to Uncle Sadiq, and to my mother. I started a small fund for girls who wanted to study but couldn't afford it. I went back to the same railway station where I once slept and opened a free clinic nearby. Sometimes young girls would come to me, shy and scared. One of them asked, "Can someone like me really become a doctor?" I smiled and said, "Someone like you? I was you." Chapter 13. I was offered a life I couldn't afford to take. One day, after years of service, I received a letter from a private hospital in the city. Modern building, high salary, air-conditioned rooms, and patients who paid in cash. They were offering me a job, more money in 1 month than I had seen in a whole year. Everyone told me to take it. "You've suffered enough," they said. "You deserve comfort now." And maybe they were right. I thought about it. I walked through their shiny corridors once. I even sat in their guest room drinking tea from a glass cup. Something I'd never done before. But then I stepped outside and saw a man on the footpath holding his sick wife in his arms. He wasn't carrying money. He was carrying hope, the kind of hope that once lived in me. That evening, I sat alone and thought, what is a doctor without pain? What is healing without sacrifice? I didn't take the job. I returned to my little free clinic because I wasn't here to be rich. I was here to serve. Chapter 14. The day I spoke to my mother. Again. Years later, on a quiet night, I visited the grave where my mother was buried. Just a small stone on dusty land. No flowers. No name. I sat beside it, wearing the white coat she never saw. I placed a stethoscope on the stone, smiled, and said, "I made it, Mama." I told her everything. How I had failed. How I had risen again. How I still hadn't bought gold earrings, but I had helped 93 girls return to school. How a girl once touched my feet and said, "I want to be like you." For the first time in years, I felt like I was home, not in a house, but in her silence. Chapter 15. The story ends, but the work never will. People sometimes ask me, was it worth it? Was it worth the hunger, the loneliness, the nights under streetlights, the tears, the failures, the cold benches at the railway station? I tell them this. Every time a mother thanks me for saving her child, every time a young girl dares to dream because she saw me, every time someone calls me doctor and not beggar girl, it becomes worth it all. You don't need money to change the world. You need truth, courage, and the refusal to give up. And if you're reading this, standing at the edge of your own pain, I beg you, don't quit. Your pain has a purpose. Your story has meaning. And maybe one day, someone will call you by the name you fought so hard to earn, just like they now call me, Dr. Amina. If this story made you feel something, if you were sad, happy, or felt strong, please don't stop here. If this story made you feel something, if you were sad, happy, or felt strong, don't stop here. Click subscribe to Chatterbox Kids for more emotional stories that help you learn English. Click the bell icon so you get every new story. Please write a comment. Which part of the story touched your heart the most? Your words help us make better stories for you. Together, we can share stories that give hope, teach lessons, and make us feel strong.